Hey guys, welcome to the Endgame series. This is our first video on the Endgame. Endgame is one of the most important phases in the game of chess. A slightest of mistake can change the results so drastically, and you have to be very careful in how you approach it. In this video, we are going to discuss about a very important concept called opposition and what are critical squares and what are the various strategies that you can employ from A to H pawn. So each pawn has got its own method and practice in order to have a very convincing victory against your opponent in the end game. So in this video, I will be showing you the first position, which you see right here, and introduce this concept called opposition. So what is opposition exactly? If you look at this king and you have your opponent's king here, you are not able to move forward because the king is present here. The black's king is stopping you from moving forward, stopping all the advancement that you would like to have in your game. So if you look at black's king, neither is able to move forward. He is also blocked by your own king. So when the kings face off each other and not letting each other to pass to the other side of the board, it's called an opposition. So the situation what we see here is called an opposition. And right now, whoever has to move will have to pay the price. Meaning, if it is white's turn, since he has an extra pawn, he would like to get it promoted into a queen. Unfortunately, that is not going to happen just because it's his own move. So he has to walk out of the opposition. The player who is going to walk out of the opposition is always at a disadvantage. So let's say white tries to move d3. Black's king will immediately move to d5 and take the opposition, not letting him to pass any side. Now, even if he tries to go here, he comes here. Suppose he goes to f3, comes to f5. So at some point, he may have to push this pawn. Maybe he goes forward and gives a check. Now you go back and stop it. So the king has no other option than to protect this pawn. Very important thing for black player is to choose where he wants to go. Now, he has to choose to go e6, just straight behind the pawn, not choosing any particular side. The reason being, whichever side white tries to move in, you can just walk in time and take the opposition. And if the pawn is pushed, again you block it. The king has to block. Now what you have to do with your king? Just walk backwards and do nothing else. So the king, let's say, goes to f5, then black takes f7. And you push e6, king goes to e7. The king comes to e5 to protect the pawn. Now again, very critical move for black. Black king has to choose a square. Where should black go? I give you 10 seconds. Please think through. Okay, I believe you found the right answer. King to e8. That's the only correct answer. And if white tries to go here, king comes to d8 and you try to push this pawn. King goes to e8 and king e6, leading to a stalemate. And that's how black can hold the draw playing correctly. And white cannot make a progress because he is losing the opposition. So I will be showing you one more position, same position, but it is black's turn to play. Let's see what happens. All right, let's look at this position. It is same as the previous one. The only difference is that it's black's turn to play. So Black has to give up the opposition and choose a side. Maybe he wants to go back or he may want to go to the sides. But whichever choices that he makes, white is going to have a terrific advantage. Let's say he goes f5, then all you need to do is to go the other side. Why? You need to understand, if this pawn has to be promoted into a queen, your king plays a major role in providing a support from either d7 or f7. So these are the critical squares for your white's king, right? So if white needs to promote it, he has to somehow reach his king to either d7 or f7 so that this pawn can be comfortably promoted into a queen. So he goes the other side. Now let's say black goes to e6, king to e4, taking the opposition, asking him to decide which side he wants to go. Now let's say he goes this, king d6, then king f5, take the opposition. Black cannot commit the mistake of coming forward because you would just give him a check and start pushing it, and then easily you can promote your pawn to a queen with the help of your king quickly reaching to f7. So he may not want to go here. Instead, he may want to hold his ground here on e7. Now again, go to e5 with your king and take the opposition. Once you have this opposition, let's say he goes to f7. All you need to do is to go king d6. Now, whatever he does, it doesn't matter whether he tries to go back or come forward, doesn't matter. Let's say he goes back. You can choose to take a position, but what's most recommended is to start pushing this pawn up. Let's say he comes and takes the opposition. Now you push it. He has to walk out of the opposition. Now you take the opposition with your king. This is the most critical move. So once he walks out of the position, let's say f8, then you take control of d7 square. So the opposition is taken. Whatever the king tries, you just push it and then you get a queen. So it doesn't matter, you get a queen. So that's how opposition can change the outcome of the game depending upon whose turn it is to play. So that's everything about opposition. But one thing I would like to mention here is you need to also remember, if it is an e pawn, the king has to go and capture critical squares. So for this pawn, the critical square for the king is either d7 or f7. All right. Now let me challenge you. What if it is a f pawn? What are the critical squares for this king? That's right. It is e7 and g7. Okay, what if it was a c pawn? The critical squares are b7 and d7. So that's how the concept of critical square, along with a position and whose side it is to move, can change the outcome of the game. All right. Now, what about G pawn or B pawn? It's a little tricky. I will show you what happens with G pawn and B pawn. All right. Here we have the next position. As you can see, there is a pawn which is on B5. Your king is very well settled here. And it's white's turn to play. Of course, if you have thought about the critical squares for this pawn, what do you think are the critical squares for this pawn? Naturally, you might be thinking A7 and C7, but we got to be very cautious as we move towards the edge of the board. Here, let's see what happens if white goes and takes this critical square. Black has no squares to move to. This square is taken, this square is taken. All the squares are taken, is left with only one option to go back. And sadly, if you push this pawn, it's a stalemate. That's why we got to be very careful, because as we move to the edge of the board, the critical squares gets limited. So for this position, the B pawn, the critical square is only one square, which is A7. C7 is not a critical square, because if you go and capture it, we saw what happened. It leads to a stalemate. Right. So what should white do here? First, go to C7. The king has to walk out, take the only available square, which is on A8. And now comes the very important technique. You need to bring your king to B6. As it walks here, you see the king has only one square to go, which is B8, and you move to A6. Now, if he takes A8, it doesn't matter. All that you need to do is to push this pawn. After he goes here to B8, you push this pawn to B7. Now, all the important squares are taken. The king has to walk out. Now, you go to A7 with your king and promote it into a queen. So that's how you deal with B pawn and G pawn. Okay, so I hope you got this concept right. Let's check what happens with the H pawn. So here we have the H pawn. Now it's white to play. What should white do here? If you were white, what will you do? I give you about 10 seconds. Think through and find the answer. Okay. I hope you thought through all the variations and found the right move. Let's see what happens if you play H4. This is a blunder. Why this is a blunder? The black king would walk to D6, taking the opposition. And if you thought you would like outrun him by playing king E4, king E6, king F4, king F6, king G4, king G7. He doesn't have to worry about opposition anymore, because it's the edge of the board. So even if you try to go and take the opposition, he goes and sits there. And even if you go to H6 and claim opposition, he just needs to repeat it. Why he will repeat it? It's because even when the pawn gets advanced, there is no way to kick this king from H8. Like if you push this, it's stalemate. If you move the king, he is just going to repeat it. There is no way white can progress and get a queen. So that's why pushing the pawn is a blunder. Now let's go back. So what should white do here? The right answer is king to E5. This is the only winning move. If black tries to go king D7, then king F7. King E8, king G7. This is the critical square for H pawn. And now white has maintained a shield for black's king. He cannot cross over this point, so he has to walk up all the way. Now you push the pawn 2 steps forward. If he comes here, push H5, king F5, H6, king G5, H7, and there is no way to stop him. So as you can see, very subtle and small elements can change the outcome of the game. With A pawn and H pawn, you got to be very careful. You cannot allow your opponent to sit at the edge of the board. Like H8 and A8, you cannot allow his king to go and occupy. The moment he occupies, the game is absolutely dead draw. With G pawn and B pawn, what are the critical squares? For G pawn, it is H7. For B pawn, it is A7. For all the other pawns, which is C pawn, D pawn, you need to choose the 7th rank of the adjacent files. If for C pawn, it is B7 and D7. For D pawn, it is C7 and E7, and so on. So that's the square your king wants to occupy. And remember this technique. And I'm sure you will be faced with numerous counts of opportunities when you play online or with your friends. You will most often find this situation coming up. And I hope this video helped. Thanks everyone, and see you all in another video. Bye.